The glass bottle felt cold against Clara Bennett's trembling fingers as she slipped it beneath her threadbare shawl, her heart hammering so violently she thought everyone in Thompson's general store could surely hear it pounding against her ribs on that sweltering August afternoon in 1882. She had never stolen anything in her 22 years of life, had been raised by her mother to believe that honesty was the foundation of a decent soul, but desperation had a way of reshaping a person's morals when death came knocking at the door. The laudanum and fever reducer in her possession cost $3, money she simply did not have after paying for her mother's last visit from Doc Harrison 2 weeks prior. Her mother's consumption had worsened dramatically over the past month, the coughing fits growing so severe that blood now stained the handkerchiefs Clara boiled and scrubbed every evening until her knuckles were raw. Clara turned toward the door, forcing her legs to move naturally despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The afternoon sun blazed through the dusty windows of the store in Redemption, Texas, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. She was 3 steps from freedom when a hand closed around her wrist, firm but not painful, and a deep voice spoke directly behind her. "I think you forgot to pay for something, miss." Her blood turned to ice. Clara slowly turned to face the man who had caught her, preparing herself to see the stern face of Mr. Thompson ready to haul her before the sheriff. Instead, she found herself looking up into the weathered, sun-bronzed face of a cowboy she had never seen before. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that stretched the fabric of his dusty blue shirt. Dark hair curled slightly beneath his worn Stetson, and his eyes, a striking shade of gray-green, studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away but somehow held her captive. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I can explain." The cowboy's gaze moved from her face to the obvious bulge beneath her shawl, then back to her eyes. She watched something shift in his expression, a hardness softening around the edges. "You sick?" "No, my mother. She has consumption. The fever is so high today, and the coughing." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "I have no money left. Everything went to the doctor, to food, to keeping our boarding house room for 1 more week." The cowboy released her wrist, and Clara thought for a wild moment that he might let her go. Instead, he gently took the bottles from beneath her shawl, reading the labels with a focused concentration that suggested he was familiar with medicine. His jaw tightened. "How long has she been ill?" 6 months, but it got bad about 8 weeks ago." Clara could not understand why this stranger was asking questions instead of dragging her to face justice. "Sir, I know what I did was wrong. I have never stolen anything before in my life. But she is dying, and I cannot watch her suffer when something might ease her pain." The cowboy looked at her for a long moment, and Clara saw something in his eyes she could not quite name. Grief, perhaps, or recognition of pain he himself had known. Without a word, he walked to the counter where Mr. Thompson stood sorting through a ledger, seemingly oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in his store. "I would like to purchase these items," the cowboy said, placing the bottles on the counter. Clara's mouth fell open. "Sir, you do not have to—" $3.20, Mr. Thompson announced, squinting at the bottles through his spectacles. The cowboy pulled bills from his pocket without hesitation, counting them out onto the scarred wooden counter. Clara stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. This stranger was paying for the medicine she had tried to steal. It made no sense. "Do you have anything else that might help someone with consumption?" the cowboy asked Mr. Thompson. "Something for the cough, for building strength?" The shopkeeper disappeared into his back room and returned with a brown bottle and a small tin. "This here is a honey and herb mixture for the cough, and this tonic has iron in it. Doc Harrison recommends it for folks who are wasting away. Helps with the appetite and energy." "I will take both." The cowboy placed more money on the counter. "No, truly, you have done more than enough," Clara protested, finding her voice at last. "I cannot accept charity from a stranger." The cowboy turned to face her, and the look in his eyes silenced her objections. "It is not charity. Consider it a loan. If that sits better with your pride, you can pay me back when circumstances improve. They both knew her circumstances were unlikely to improve, not with her mother dying and no other family to speak of. But Clara found herself nodding because the alternative was refusing medicine that might give her mother even a few more comfortable days. Mr. Thompson wrapped the items in brown paper and tied the package with string. The cowboy took it and handed it to Clara, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for just a moment. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her despite the heat of the day. "Thank you," Clara managed to whisper. "I do not even know your name." "James Cordell. I just drove cattle up from San Antonio, getting supplies before heading back to my ranch." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internally. "Where are you staying?" "Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, 3 streets over near the church." Clara clutched the package to her chest like a lifeline. "Room 7. James nodded slowly. "I would like to check on your mother, if you would allow it. I have some experience with sickness, and I want to make sure you have everything you need." Every instinct Clara possessed told her she should refuse, should not allow this stranger into the small room where she and her mother lived. But something in James Cordell's face made her trust him in a way she could not explain. Perhaps it was the genuine concern in his eyes, or the fact that he had already shown her more kindness than anyone else in this town where she and her mother were merely temporary residents with no connections and no standing. "All right," Clara heard herself say. "She would probably rest easier after the medicine takes effect." They walked through the dusty streets of Redemption together, an unlikely pair that drew curious stares from the few people lingering in the oppressive afternoon heat. James led his horse, a magnificent buckskin gelding, by the reins. Clara noticed he walked on the street side of the boardwalk, placing himself between her and the road in a gesture of protection that felt both old-fashioned and somehow comforting. "Have you lived in Redemption long?" James asked as they walked. "No, only about 4 months. We came from Missouri after my father passed away last year. Mother thought the warmer, drier climate might be better for her lungs, but—" Clara trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. The Texas heat had not saved her mother. If anything, the dust storms and brutal sun had made things worse. "I am sorry about your father." "Thank you, he was a good man. Worked as a bookkeeper for a freight company." Clara found herself talking more than she normally would with a stranger. "Mother took in sewing after he died, trying to support us both, but then she got sick and the work became impossible. I have been doing laundry and mending for some of the local families, but it does not pay nearly enough." They reached Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, a weathered 2-story structure that had seen better days. The white paint was peeling, and the front steps sagged slightly in the middle. Clara led James up to the 2nd floor, acutely aware of how shabby everything must appear to him. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and mildew. She unlocked the door to room 7 with a key she kept on a string around her neck. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the narrow bed where her mother lay, a small dresser, and a chair by the single window. Clara had tried to make it homelike with a few wildflowers in a chipped vase, and a crocheted doily her mother had made years ago, but there was no disguising the poverty that permeated every corner. "Mama," Clara said softly, moving to the bedside, "I have brought medicine, and someone who wants to help." Her mother stirred, opening eyes that had once been bright blue but now appeared faded and glassy with fever. Margaret Bennett had been a beautiful woman once, but illness had hollowed her cheeks and given her skin a grayish pallor that spoke of approaching death. She was only 46 years old, but looked 20 years older. "Clara?" Her voice was a thin rasp. "You should not have spent money on medicine. We need that for food." "Hush now, Mama. A kind gentleman purchased it." Clara uncorked the fever reducer, measuring out a careful dose into the spoon she kept by the bedside. James removed his hat and stood just inside the doorway, his presence somehow filling the small room without making it feel more crowded. Clara noticed the way his eyes took in every detail: the threadbare quilt, the basin of water she kept for cooling her mother's forehead, the stack of blood-stained handkerchiefs she had not yet had time to wash. After administering the medicine, Clara gave her mother sips of water and applied a fresh, cool cloth to her burning forehead. James watched in silence, and when Margaret's eyes drifted closed again, exhausted by even that small amount of activity, he finally spoke. "Miss Bennet, might I have a word with you in the hallway?" Clara followed him out, closing the door gently behind her. In the dim hallway, James looked even taller, his shoulders nearly spanning the narrow width. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly as he seemed to search for words. "Your mother needs more help than you can provide alone," he said finally. "She needs constant care, proper food, fresh air, and a clean environment. This room." He stopped himself, clearly not wanting to insult her. "It is not a place where someone can heal?" "I am aware of that," Clara said, trying to keep the defensive edge from her voice. "But it is what I can afford, and barely that. The week is nearly up, and I do not know if Mrs. Patterson will extend us credit again." James was quiet for a moment, that internal wrestling visible on his face again. When he spoke, his words shocked her to her core. "Come home with me, both of you. I have a ranch about 20 miles north of here. A decent house with spare rooms and a woman who comes in twice a week to cook and clean. Mrs. Garcia has experience nursing sick folks. Your mother would have a real bed in a real room with windows that open to fresh air. You would not have to worry about rent or money for food." Clara stared at him, certain she must have misheard. "Sir, I cannot possibly accept such an offer. It would not be proper. People would talk, and I do not know you at all." "I understand your hesitation," James said, his gray-green eyes meeting hers steadily. "I am not asking anything improper of you, Miss Bennet. I have a housekeeper who can serve as chaperone. You and your mother would have your own space, your privacy. I am simply offering you a place where your mother might have a chance to recover, or at least to spend her final days in comfort rather than suffering in this place." "Why?" Clara asked, the question bursting from her. "Why would you do this for complete strangers? What possible reason could you have?" James looked away, his jaw working. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with barely contained emotion. 3 years ago, my younger sister got sick with consumption. She was only 17. I was away on a cattle drive, gone for months, trying to earn enough money to expand the ranch my father had left me. By the time I got home, Sarah had died. She spent her last weeks in a small, dark room much like this one because my aunt who was caring for her could not afford anything better. I never got to say goodbye. I never got to make her comfortable or let her know she was loved." The pain in his voice was so raw that Clara felt her own throat tighten with sympathetic grief. She understood now. This was not really about her and her mother. This was about James trying to save someone he had failed to save before. "I am so sorry," Clara whispered. "That must have been unbearably painful." It was. It still is. James looked back at her, and she saw the sheen of moisture in his eyes that he was too proud to let fall. "I cannot bring Sarah back, but maybe I can help your mother. Maybe I can give you what I could not give my sister: time, care, comfort. Please, let me do this. Not for you, but for me. Let me make something right." Clara felt something crack open in her chest, a wall she had built around herself during these long months of struggle and fear. This man, this stranger, was offering her everything she had been praying for in her desperate moments alone. How could she refuse? "If we do this," she said slowly, "I will work to earn our keep. I can cook, clean, mend, tend animals, whatever you need. I will not be a burden." "You would not be a burden regardless," James said firmly. "But if working makes you feel better about accepting help, then we can arrange that. Though your first priority should be caring for your mother." "When would we leave?" "Tomorrow morning if your mother can travel. I will rent a wagon with a padded bed so she can lie down comfortably. It will take most of the day to reach the ranch, but we can go slowly and stop to rest as often as needed." Clara thought of her mother lying in that narrow bed in that stifling room, thought of the rent coming due and the landlady's thin-lipped disapproval, thought of the long, lonely nights watching her mother suffer while feeling utterly powerless to help. Then she thought of fresh air and proper care and not having to choose between medicine and food. "Yes," she said. "Yes, we will come with you." James's entire face transformed with his smile, relief, and something else. Gratitude, perhaps, making him look younger and less careworn. "Thank you. I will make the arrangements and return here at first light, sir." He settled his hat back on his head and turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Bennet, what you tried to do today, stealing that medicine, I am not condoning theft, but I understand it. Love makes us capable of things we never thought possible. Your mother is lucky to have a daughter who loves her so fiercely." Before Clara could respond, he was descending the stairs, his boots thudding softly on the worn wood. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of less than an hour. Her life had changed completely, and she did not even know if it was for better or worse. She only knew that she had to trust this stranger because the alternative was watching her mother die in that terrible little room. Clara returned to her mother's bedside and began administering the cough syrup. Margaret opened her eyes, more alert now that the fever medicine was beginning to work. "Who was that man?" her mother asked. "Someone who wants to help us, Mama. His name is James Cordell, and he has invited us to stay at his ranch where you can be properly cared for. Clara, we cannot impose on a stranger. We do not have a choice, Mama. I cannot keep you here. I cannot afford to keep us anywhere. This might be the miracle we have been praying for." Clara smoothed her mother's thin hair back from her forehead. "Please, just let someone help us for once." Margaret searched her daughter's face, then nodded weakly. "If you trust him, then I will trust your judgment. You have always been a good judge of character." Clara hoped desperately that her mother was right. That night, Clara packed their few belongings into the 2 carpet bags they owned. It did not take long. They had sold most of their possessions during the journey from Missouri and in the month since. She folded her mother's good dress carefully, the dark blue one she had worn to Clara's father's funeral, and her own Sunday dress of simple gray cotton. Their undergarments, a few handkerchiefs, her mother's Bible, and a small framed daguerreotype of Clara's father completed their worldly goods. Clara sat by the window after her mother fell into a restless sleep, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. She thought about James Cordell and the grief she had seen in his eyes when he spoke of his sister. She understood that kind of loss, that helpless rage at death's inevitability. She had felt it when her father died, had been feeling it every day as she watched her mother slip further away. But there was something else she was feeling too, something she did not want to examine too closely. When James had looked at her, when his hand had brushed hers, when he had smiled, she had felt something stir inside her that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way his presence made her feel safe and seen and somehow less alone. She barely knew him. She had no business feeling anything beyond thankfulness for his charity. Yet as she drifted off to sleep in the chair beside her mother's bed, it was James's face she saw in her mind, those gray-green eyes looking at her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. True to his word, James appeared at dawn with a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 strong horses. The wagon bed had been filled with blankets and pillows, creating a soft nest for Margaret. Mrs. Patterson stood on her front porch watching the proceedings with obvious disapproval. But Clara paid the remaining rent she owed and thanked the woman for her hospitality with more grace than the sour-faced landlady deserved. James lifted Margaret from her bed with surprising gentleness for such a large man, carrying her down the stairs and settling her in the wagon as if she weighed nothing at all. Clara climbed up onto the bench seat beside him, their bags stowed behind them. "Ready?" James asked, gathering the reins. Clara looked back at the boarding house, at the town of redemption with its dusty streets and indifferent residents. She had found no redemption here, only struggle and sorrow. Perhaps the next chapter would be different. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." They rolled out of town as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The morning air was already warm, promising another scorching day, but there was something hopeful about the light that Clara chose to interpret as a good sign. James drove with competent ease, his hands steady on the reins. They traveled in silence for the first hour, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Clara found herself watching him from the corner of her eye, noting the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair, the strong line of his jaw, the easy confidence of his posture. "Tell me about your ranch," Clara said finally, wanting to fill the quiet with something other than the sound of hoofbeats and creaking wheels. "It is called the Broken Arrow," James said, his face lighting up in a way that told her this was a subject dear to his heart. "My father started it about 30 years ago with just a few hundred acres and a dozen head of cattle. I have built it up to nearly 3,000 acres now, running about 800 head. It is good land, with a creek that runs year-round and plenty of grass. The house is not fancy, but it is solid. 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, a parlor, and a covered porch that catches the evening breeze." "It sounds wonderful," Clara said honestly. Compared to the cramped boarding house room, it sounded like a palace. "I have 3 hands who work for me. Miguel, his brother Carlos, and an old-timer named Hank who has been there since my father's day. They bunk in the old cabin about 100 yards from the main house. Mrs. Garcia, who I mentioned, is Miguel's mother. She is a good woman, kind-hearted, and makes the best tortillas you will ever taste." "You seem to care a great deal about your people," Clara observed. "They are more than employees. They are family, especially after my father passed 5 years ago, and then Sarah." James's voice grew somber. "My mother died when I was born, so I never knew her. It was just me and Sarah and Pa for the longest time. Then it was just me and Sarah, then just me." "You must have felt very alone." "I did. I threw myself into the ranch, working from dawn until I could barely stand, trying to exhaust myself enough that I would not think about how empty the house felt." He glanced at her. "Having you and your mother there will be good. The house needs life in it again." They stopped at midday to rest the horses and check on Margaret. The older woman was awake but weak, the journey clearly taxing her limited strength. James produced a canteen of cool water and some bread and cheese he had packed. They ate in the shade of a cottonwood tree, and Clara coaxed her mother into taking a few small bites and drinking some water. "How much farther?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "About 4 more hours at this pace," James answered gently. "Are you managing all right, Mrs. Bennet? We can rest longer if you need." "No, I would rather keep moving. The sooner we arrive, the sooner Clara can stop worrying." Margaret managed a small smile for her daughter. "She has been doing entirely too much worrying lately." "With good reason," Clara said, settling her mother back into the cushioned wagon bed. "But things will be better now, Mama. I can feel it." The afternoon stretched long and hot as they continued north. The landscape shifted gradually, the flat, dusty plains giving way to gently rolling hills dotted with mesquite and live oak trees. Clara saw cattle grazing in the distance, their hides dark against the golden grass. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermal currents, and once they spotted a small group of pronghorn antelope bounding away across the hills. James pointed out landmarks as they traveled, telling her about the land and its history. She learned that he was 28 years old, that he had fought briefly in the tail end of conflicts with Comanche raiders when he was younger, that he loved this harsh, beautiful country with a passion that ran bone deep. Clara found herself talking too, sharing stories about her childhood in Missouri, about her father's patient kindness and her mother's skill with a needle, about the plans she had once harbored of becoming a school teacher before her father's death had shattered those dreams. James listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he truly cared about her answers. By the time they crested a final rise and James said, "There it is, the broken arrow," Clara felt as if she had known him far longer than a single day. The connection between them had grown with each passing mile, something fragile and tentative, but undeniably present. The ranch spread out before them in a valley carved by a winding creek lined with cottonwood trees. The house was larger than Clara had expected, built of honey-colored stone and weathered wood, with a wide porch wrapped around two sides and a stone chimney rising from one end. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and what looked like a smokehouse. It was not grand by the standards of wealthy ranchers, but it was solid and well-maintained and beautiful in its simplicity. "It is lovely," Clara breathed. James smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Welcome home." That word, home, echoed in Clara's mind as they rolled down the hill toward the ranch. She had not had a real home since leaving Missouri. Could this place truly become that for her and her mother? As they pulled into the yard, people emerged from various buildings. A weathered older man with a gray beard, two younger men with sun-bronzed skin and dark eyes, and a round woman with iron gray hair pulled back in a bun hurried toward them. "Boss, we did not expect you back so soon," the older man said, then stopped short when he saw Clara and Margaret. "You brought company." "Hank, Miguel, Carlos, Mrs. Garcia, this is Miss Clara Bennett and her mother, Mrs. Margaret Bennett. They will be staying with us for a while. Mrs. Bennett is ill and needs care. Mrs. Garcia, I was hoping you might help with nursing duties if you are willing." The older woman's dark eyes swept over Margaret's pale face and thin form, and Clara saw understanding and compassion dawn there. "Of course, Senor James. I will do whatever I can. Let us get her inside and comfortable immediately." The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. James carried Margaret into the house, up the stairs to a bedroom that Clara was amazed to see had actual wallpaper on the walls, a pattern of tiny blue flowers that must have cost a fortune. The bed was large, with a real mattress and clean sheets that smelled of sunshine and lavender. Windows on two walls let in light and air. Mrs. Garcia immediately took charge, sending Carlos to fetch cool water and clean cloths, directing Miguel to bring up the bags, ordering Hank to tell his wife that she would be staying at the ranch for a few days to help. The woman moved with the confidence of someone used to managing a household, and Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders at having someone else share the burden of care. James showed Clara to the room next to her mother's, a smaller but equally charming space with a window overlooking the creek. "This was Sarah's room," he said quietly. "I think she would like knowing someone was using it again." "Are you certain?" Clara asked, touched and also slightly uncomfortable with occupying a dead girl's space. "I am certain. She would have liked you." James paused in the doorway. "Get yourself settled, then come down to the kitchen. You must be hungry, and Mrs. Garcia always keeps things ready for unexpected guests." After he left, Clara sank down onto the bed, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Not from despair, but from relief so intense it was almost painful. They were safe. Her mother would have proper care. They would eat real meals and sleep in real beds. The constant gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long could finally ease, if only for a little while. When she had composed herself, Clara washed her face in the basin that stood on a dresser, changed into her less dusty dress, and went downstairs. The kitchen was large and warm despite the heat of the day, with a big stove, a scrubbed wooden table, and copper pots hanging from hooks. The smell of something delicious cooking made Clara's stomach growl audibly. James sat at the table drinking coffee, still wearing his dusty travel clothes. He looked up when she entered and gestured to a chair. "Mrs. Garcia made stew. There's always stew ready in the pot here. Help yourself." Clara ladled a generous portion into a bowl and sat down across from him. The first bite was heaven. Rich beef, tender vegetables, savory broth. She had not eaten this well in longer than she could remember. "Your mother is resting," James reported. "Mrs. Garcia gave her some broth and more medicine. She says the consumption is advanced, but not necessarily beyond hope. Good food, rest, and care can work wonders sometimes." "Sometimes," Clara echoed, trying not to think about the alternative. "I cannot thank you enough for all of this, James. I do not even have words adequate to express my gratitude. You do not need to thank me. Just let me help. That is thanks enough. He sipped his coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. Tomorrow I will show you around the ranch properly. For tonight, just rest. You look exhausted. Clara realized she was exhausted, bone-deep tired in a way that went beyond physical weariness. She finished her stew, accepted a second helping when James insisted, then climbed the stairs to her new room as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange. She checked on her mother and found Margaret sleeping peacefully, her breathing easier than it had been in days. Mrs. Garcia sat in a rocking chair beside the bed, knitting needles clicking softly, and she smiled at Clara in a way that conveyed reassurance without words. In her own room, Clara changed into her nightgown and opened the window to let in the evening breeze. It carried the scent of grass and water and something indefinably sweet. She could hear the lowing of cattle in the distance, the chirp of crickets, the murmur of male voices from the bunkhouse. These were good sounds, peaceful sounds. As she drifted off to sleep in a real bed for the first time in months, Clara thought about James Cordell and the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. She had tried to steal medicine, and instead of punishment, she had found sanctuary. She did not believe in coincidence. Perhaps this was divine intervention, God answering her desperate prayers in a way she never could have imagined. Or perhaps it was something even more profound than that. Perhaps it was the beginning of something neither she nor James could yet see, but both of them were meant to discover. The days that followed established a new rhythm to Clara's life. She woke each morning to the sound of roosters crowing and men moving about the yard, preparing for the day's work. She would check on her mother first, usually finding Mrs. Garcia already there with breakfast and medicine. Margaret's condition stabilized in those first few days. She was not improving dramatically, but she was not getting worse either. And after months of steady decline, even stability felt like a miracle. Clara insisted on earning her keep despite James's protests. She took over much of the cooking, discovering that she enjoyed working in the large, well-stocked kitchen. She baked bread and pies, made hearty breakfasts for the ranch hands, prepared meals that Mrs. Garcia taught her with Mexican flavors she had never encountered before. She mended shirts and sewed buttons and patched worn work clothes. She swept and scrubbed and polished until the house gleamed. James protested at first, insisting she was a guest and not a servant, but Clara held firm. "Let me do this," she told him. "Let me contribute. Otherwise, I will feel like a kept woman, and that is not something I can accept." He had looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you are not to work yourself to exhaustion. Part of the deal is that you take care of yourself too." "Agreed," Clara said, and they shook hands on it like business partners, though the warmth of his palm against hers felt like anything but business. As the days turned into weeks, Clara found herself settling into life at the Broken Arrow with an ease that surprised her. The ranch hands accepted her presence with good-natured friendliness. Old Hank taught her how to feed the chickens and collect eggs without getting pecked. Miguel showed her the vegetable garden his mother tended and let her help with weeding and watering. Carlos, the youngest and shyest of the three, played his guitar in the evenings and taught her Spanish songs, but it was James who occupied most of her thoughts. He worked long, hard days, riding out before dawn to check on cattle, mend fences, manage the 1,000 tasks that running a ranch required. He came home dusty and tired, but he always stopped by to visit with Margaret before supper, sitting beside her bed and telling her stories about his day in a gentle voice that made Clara's mother smile. In the evenings, after the dishes were washed and Margaret was settled for the night, Clara and James would sit on the porch and talk. They discussed everything: books they had read, places they dreamed of seeing, philosophies of life and death, and everything in between. James was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that caught Clara off guard and made her laugh at unexpected moments. She learned that he loved horses with an almost spiritual devotion, that he could not carry a tune to save his life, that he had a secret fondness for poetry, though he pretended to find it impractical. He learned that she had once wanted to paint, that she was terrible at mathematics, that she could recite entire passages from Shakespeare from memory because her father had read the plays aloud to her as a child. And slowly, incrementally, the distance between them on the porch swing decreased. An accidental brush of hands became a deliberate touch. A casual conversation became something charged with unspoken emotion. Clara found herself noticing things about James that had nothing to do with gratitude. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the breadth of his shoulders, the sound of his laugh, the unexpected gentleness in his work-roughened hands. She was falling in love with him. The realization came to her one evening as she watched him from the kitchen window, saw him gentling a skittish horse with infinite patience and kindness, and her heart simply opened and claimed him as its own. The feeling terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, but she said nothing. How could she? She was living in his house, dependent on his charity. Any profession of feeling from her would seem like obligation or manipulation. And she had no idea if James felt anything beyond compassion for a woman in need, and perhaps the companionship of a friend. 6 weeks after their arrival at the Broken Arrow, Margaret had a particularly good day. She sat up in bed, ate a full meal, and asked Clara to help her outside to sit on the porch. Mrs. Garcia fussed and worried, but Margaret insisted, and Clara recognized the look in her mother's eyes. She wanted to see the sky, feel the sun, remember what living felt like before the consumption took even that from her. They settled Margaret in a chair with quilts and pillows, and she sat for nearly an hour watching the afternoon unfold around her. James came in from checking the southern pastures and stopped when he saw Margaret there. His face broke into a wide smile. "Mrs. Bennet, it is good to see you out here," he said, climbing the porch steps. "You look stronger." "I feel almost human today," Margaret admitted. "It has been a very long time since I could say that. I owe you my gratitude, Mr. Cordell. You have given me something precious, time with my daughter, and a beautiful place to rest my eyes." "You owe me nothing," James said, settling himself on the porch railing. "It has been my pleasure having you both here." Margaret's knowing eyes moved between James and Clara, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Clara, would you fetch me some tea? I find myself quite thirsty." "Of course, Mama." Clara hurried inside, grateful for something to do with her hands. But when she returned several minutes later with a teapot and cups, she found James and her mother deep in conversation that stopped abruptly when she appeared. "What were you two discussing?" Clara asked suspiciously, pouring tea. "Just getting to know each other better," Margaret said innocently, but her eyes sparkled with a mischief Clara had not seen there in months. That evening, after Margaret had been helped back to bed and had fallen quickly into exhausted sleep, Clara found James in the barn currying his buckskin horse. She stood in the doorway watching him work, the play of muscles in his back visible through his shirt, the careful, methodical strokes of the brush. "She really is doing better, is she not?" Clara said, announcing her presence. "It is not just wishful thinking on my part." James turned, his face softening when he saw her. "She is doing better. Mrs. Garcia says her appetite has improved, and the coughing fits are less frequent. I do not know if it will last, Clara. I do not want to give you false hope, but right now, yes, she is better." Clara nodded, fighting the tears that threatened. She had learned to protect herself from hope, had trained herself not to expect miracles because disappointment hurt too much. But seeing her mother sit outside today, seeing her smile and joke and seem like herself again, it was impossible not to hope. "Hey," James said softly, crossing to her. "Whatever happens, we will face it together. You are not alone anymore." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Clara's breath caught at the tenderness of the gesture, at the way he was looking at her as if she was something precious and breakable. "James," she whispered, not even sure what she wanted to say. "I know this is complicated," he said, his voice rough. "I know you are here because of circumstances, not choice. But Clara, these past weeks with you I have not felt this alive since before Sarah died. You have brought light back into this house, into my life. I do not want to make you uncomfortable, And if I'm reading this wrong, tell me and I will never speak of it again. But I need you to know that my feelings for you have nothing to do with charity or pity and everything to do with who you are. You are strong and kind and beautiful, and I am falling in love with you." Clara's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "You are not reading it wrong," she managed to say. "I am falling in love with you too. I have been for weeks. I was just too afraid to say anything, too worried that you would think I was only responding to your kindness." James's face transformed with joy and relief. "Then I can do this?" he asked, cupping her face in both hands. "Yes," Clara breathed. "Please." He kissed her then, softly at first, tentatively, as if she might shatter. But when she responded, when she rose up on her toes and wrapped her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home and embarking on an adventure all at once. Clara had been kissed before, chaste pecks from a boy she had briefly courted back in Missouri, but nothing had prepared her for this, for the way James held her, as if she was both infinitely delicate and absolutely essential, for the way her entire body seemed to wake up and recognize him as something it had been waiting for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Only weeks?" Clara teased breathlessly. "I have wanted it since that first day in the store when you looked at me like you could see straight into my soul." "I probably could," James said seriously. "I saw someone brave and desperate and fighting for the person she loved. How could I not fall for you right then?" They stood together in the barn, holding each other as the evening deepened into night around them, and Clara felt something settle into place inside her. This was where she belonged, this man, this place, this life. It was what she had been searching for without even knowing she was lost. The romance that had been building between them for weeks now blossomed fully. James courted her properly despite the unusual circumstances, stealing moments together whenever they could. He picked wildflowers and left them on her pillow. She baked his favorite apple pie and saved him the biggest slice. They rode out together when the ranch work allowed, James teaching her to sit a horse properly and showing her the boundaries of his land. He kissed her in the barn, in the moonlight by the creek, once even daringly on the porch swing when he thought everyone else was asleep. Each kiss felt like a promise, like a foundation being laid for something permanent and true. Margaret watched the developing relationship with obvious approval. One afternoon when Clara sat with her doing mending, her mother spoke up suddenly. "You are in love with him." Clara looked up, startled. "Is it that obvious?" "To a mother, yes. And he is equally in love with you. I can see it in the way he looks at you, as if you are the sun, and he is a flower turning toward the light." Margaret reached out and took Clara's hand. "I am glad, my darling girl. I have been so worried about what would happen to you after I am gone. Knowing you will have someone who loves you, who will care for you, it eases my heart." "Mama, do not talk like that. You are getting better." "I am having a good spell, but we both know it likely will not last." Margaret squeezed Clara's fingers. "I am not afraid anymore. I have made my peace with God, and I have seen you settled somewhere safe with a good man. That is more than I dared hope for 6 weeks ago when we were in that terrible boarding house. James Cordell is a blessing, Clara. Hold on to him." "I intend to," Clara whispered fiercely. "I love him, Mama. I did not think I could fall in love so quickly, but I have. He is everything I did not know I was looking for." "Then when he asks you to marry him, and he will, say yes without hesitation. Build a life here, have babies, and raise them in this beautiful place. Be happy." Margaret's prediction came true sooner than Clara expected. 2 days later, James asked her to ride out with him after breakfast to check on a section of fence that needed mending. They rode for an hour into the hills, finally stopping beside a small spring-fed pond surrounded by cottonwood trees. The water sparkled in the morning sun, and birds sang in the branches overhead. James helped Clara dismount, his hands lingering on her waist. "There is no fence that needs mending," he admitted. I just wanted to get you alone. You could have simply asked, Clara said, smiling up at him. I could have, but I wanted to bring you here specifically. This is my favorite spot on the entire ranch. I come here when I need to think, to pray, to remember what is important. He took both her hands in his. Clara, I know we have only known each other for 8 weeks. I know that is not very long in the grand scheme of things, but I also know that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You have changed my life. You have made me want to be better, to build something worth having. I do not want to spend another day without knowing you are mine and I am yours. Clara's heart was already racing because she could see where this was leading, could see the nervous hope in James's eyes. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a simple gold band. This was my grandmother's ring. My father gave it to my mother when they married. It is not fancy, but it has been worn by women who love deeply and built lives of meaning. I would be honored if you would wear it, if you would marry me and become my wife. Yes, Clara said without hesitation, just as her mother had advised. Yes, James, I will marry you. I love you and I want to spend my life with you. James's whoop of joy startled the birds from the trees. He swept Clara up and spun her around, both of them laughing with pure happiness. When he set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, and kissed her with a passion that made her knees weak. When? He asked when they finally came up for air. How soon will you marry me? As soon as you want, Clara said, though I would like my mother to be there, to see it. Understanding and a shadow of sadness crossed James's face. Of course. We will do it as soon as we can arrange things. I will ride into town tomorrow and speak to Reverend Mitchell. Perhaps he can come here to perform the ceremony so your mother does not have to travel. They rode back to the ranch holding hands, an awkward feat on horseback that made them both laugh, but neither wanted to give up. When they arrived, they found Mrs. Garcia on the porch looking worried. Miss Clara, your mama is asking for you. She had a coughing spell, quite bad. Clara's joy evaporated instantly, replaced by cold fear. She ran inside and up the stairs, James close behind her. Margaret lay in bed, a blood-stained handkerchief pressed to her mouth, struggling for breath. Clara fell to her knees beside the bed. Mama, I am here. Try to breathe slowly. Margaret's eyes opened, focusing on her daughter with effort. Her gaze moved to James standing in the doorway, then to Clara's left hand where the ring now sat. A smile curved her lips despite the blood on them. He asked you, she whispered. He did. And I said yes. We are going to be married, Mama. You will be there to see it. I am so happy, Margaret breathed. She reached out weakly and James came forward, taking her hand. Take care of her. Promise me you will take care of my girl. I promise, James said, his voice thick with emotion. I will love her and protect her for the rest of my life. You have my word. Good, that is good. Margaret's eyes drifted closed. So tired. Rest, Mama, just rest. They kept vigil through that day and into the night. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes rambling with fever. Mrs. Garcia brought medicine and cool cloths, but they all knew this was the beginning of the end. The disease had rallied for one final assault, and Margaret's worn body had no reserves left to fight it. Clara sat beside her mother, holding her hand, refusing to leave even when James tried to coax her to rest. James eventually settled himself on the floor beside Clara's chair, his shoulder pressed against her leg, offering silent support. As dawn broke on the third day after James's proposal, Margaret opened her eyes one last time. She looked at Clara with perfect clarity and love. My beautiful daughter, she whispered, thank you for fighting so hard for me. Thank you for loving me enough to steal the medicine. You are the best thing I ever did in this life. Mama, please, Clara sobbed, please do not leave me. I must, but you will be all right. You have James. You have a home. Promise me you will be happy, Clara. Promise me you will live fully and love deeply and not spend your life grieving." "I promise," Clara choked out. "I promise, Mama." "Good girl." Margaret smiled one last time. "Tell your father I'm coming home to him." Her eyes closed. Her breathing, which had been labored and harsh, gradually softened, slowed, then simply stopped. Clara felt the exact moment her mother's spirit left, felt the hand she held grow limp and still. "No," Clara whispered. "No, no, no." James rose and pulled her into his arms, holding her as she shattered. She cried until she had no tears left, until her throat was raw and her head pounded, and exhaustion pulled her under like a tide. She woke hours later in her own bed, sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment she could not remember why her eyes felt swollen and her heart felt like a stone in her chest. Then memory crashed over her. Her mother was gone. Clara rose and walked to the room next door. Margaret lay in the bed looking peaceful, as if she were simply sleeping. Someone, Mrs. Garcia probably, had cleaned her face and combed her hair and folded her hands over her chest. She looked younger in death, the lines of pain and illness smoothed away. "Goodbye, Mama," Clara whispered. She kissed her mother's forehead one last time, feeling the cold skin beneath her lips, and turned to leave. James stood in the hallway, his face drawn with grief and worry. Without a word, he opened his arms, and Clara walked into them, letting him hold her together when she felt like flying apart. They buried Margaret 3 days later on a hill overlooking the creek, beneath a cottonwood tree that provided shade and rustling leaves like whispered prayers. Reverend Mitchell came from town to perform the service. The ranch hands stood with hats in hand, and Mrs. Garcia wept openly. James read the 23rd Psalm in a steady voice while Clara stood beside her mother's grave, feeling numb and hollowed out. After everyone else had gone back to the house, Clara remained at the graveside. James stood nearby, giving her space but staying close enough that she knew he was there. Finally, she turned to him. "She wanted me to be happy," Clara said. "She made me promise." "Then we will honor that promise," James said, taking her hand. "Together?" Clara nodded. She knew grief would walk with her for a long time, knew that there would be days when the loss of her mother felt too heavy to bear. But she also knew that Margaret had been right. She was not alone. She had James, and she had a home, and she had a future to build. 3 weeks later, on a golden September afternoon, Clara and James stood on the porch of the ranch house and exchanged wedding vows before Reverend Mitchell, with Mrs. Garcia, Miguel, Carlos, and Hank as witnesses. Clara wore her Sunday dress with wildflowers in her hair. James wore his best shirt and a bolo tie and looked at her as if she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her tenderly, and Clara tasted salt on his lips. She realized he was crying, tears of joy running down his weathered face, and her own tears started in response. "I love you, Mrs. Cordell," James whispered against her lips. "I love you too," Clara replied, and felt her heart begin to heal. Their wedding night was sweet and gentle, James taking care to make Clara feel cherished and safe as they came together for the first time. She had been nervous, uncertain what to expect, but James was patient and loving, making the experience something beautiful rather than frightening. Afterward, they lay tangled together in his bed, their bed now, and talked quietly until sleep claimed them. Life as a married woman suited Clara. She continued managing the household, but now she did it as the lady of the ranch rather than as a guest earning her keep. She and James worked side by side, building a partnership that extended beyond romance into every aspect of their lives. He valued her opinions on ranch matters, and she learned the business of cattle and land management. She taught him to appreciate the small beauties of daily life, a perfect pie crust, the way light fell through leaves, the satisfaction of a garden grown from careful tending. The seasons turned. Autumn gave way to winter. cold nights when Clara and James huddled beneath quilts and talked about their plans for the future. They wanted children, a whole house full of them to fill the rooms with noise and life. They talked about expanding the ranch, about building a legacy that would last for generations. Spring came with new calves and new hope. One morning in early April, Clara woke feeling nauseated and knew with sudden certainty what it meant. She waited until she was sure, until Mrs. Garcia confirmed her suspicion with a knowing smile, before telling James. She chose the evening when he returned from checking on the spring roundup. He looked tired but happy, and when she placed his hand on her still flat stomach and told him he was going to be a father, the joy that lit his face was better than anything Clara could have imagined. "Truly?" he asked, wonder in his voice. "A baby?" "Truly. Probably arriving around December if Mrs. Garcia's calculations are correct." James kissed her with a reverence that made her melt, then knelt and pressed his lips to her stomach. "Hello there, little one," he murmured. "Your papa is already so in love with you." Clara ran her fingers through his hair, overwhelmed with happiness. She thought about her mother, about how Margaret had wanted exactly this for her, a good man, a safe home, children, joy. She wished her mother could be here to see it, to hold her grandchild. But somehow Clara felt her presence anyway, felt her approval and love like a blessing. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Clara bloomed with health, her skin glowing and her body rounding with new life. James treated her like spun glass despite her protests that she was not fragile. He would not let her lift anything heavy or work too hard. He brought her ridiculous gifts, a rocking chair for the nursery they were preparing, a music box that played lullabies, a tiny pair of knitted booties Mrs. Garcia had made. On a cold December evening, as snow fell softly outside the windows, rare for this part of Texas but not unheard of, Clara's pains began. Mrs. Garcia took charge immediately, sending the men from the house and establishing herself in the bedroom with Clara. James paced the parlor like a caged animal, wearing a path in the floorboards. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day. Clara thought she might die from the pain, cried out for her mother more than once, but Mrs. Garcia's steady presence and James's voice through the door talking to her, encouraging her, gave her strength to continue. Finally, as afternoon light slanted through the windows, a baby's cry filled the house. Mrs. Garcia wrapped the infant in blankets and placed the tiny bundle in Clara's arms. "A boy," she announced, beaming. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Clara looked down at her son, at his red, wrinkled face and tiny, perfect fingers, and fell completely in love. When James was finally allowed into the room, he approached the bed with hesitant steps, as if approaching something holy. "Clara?" His voice was rough with emotion. "Are you all right?" "I am perfect. Come meet your son." James sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Clara placed the baby in his large, gentle hands. She watched her husband's face transform as he looked at their child, watched tears stream down his cheeks unchecked. "He is so small," James whispered in awe. "So perfect." "What should we name him?" Clara asked. James thought for a moment. "What about Thomas after your father? And perhaps Michael for a middle name after mine?" "Thomas Michael Cordell," Clara said, testing the name. "It is perfect. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world, my sweet boy." They sat together, the three of them. As snow continued to fall outside and the house settled into peaceful quiet, Clara thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, the desperation that had driven her to steal, the cowboy who had caught her and changed her life, the love that had grown between them, the losses they had suffered, and the joys they had found. She had set out to save her mother's life and had failed in that. But in the process, she had found her own life, her own love, her own future. Margaret's death had been inevitable, but her final gift to Clara had been seeing her daughter safe and loved and on the path to happiness. "What are you thinking about?" James asked softly, watching her face. Everything, Clara said. How strange life is. How the worst moments can lead to the best ones. How grateful I am that you walked into that store on that particular day. I have thought about that too, James admitted. What if I had chosen a different day to get supplies? What if I had not looked over at exactly the right moment to see you trying to leave? We might never have met. But we did meet. And you saved me. You saved both me and Mama, giving her those final, comfortable weeks and giving me you. You saved me too, James said quietly. I was half dead inside before you came, just going through the motions of living. You brought me back to life, Clara. You gave me a reason to look forward instead of back. Thomas made a small sound, and they both looked down at him, their attention captured completely by this tiny person they had created together. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair. 2 years after his birth, a daughter arrived, Emma Rose, with her father's coloring and her mother's delicate features. Then another son, William, named for no one in particular, but simply because Clara loved the name. The Broken Arrow prospered under James's management and Clara's careful household economy. They bought adjacent land, increasing their holdings to nearly 5,000 acres. They built a schoolhouse on the property and hired a teacher so their children and those of the ranch hands could receive education. They established a small library in town in memory of Margaret Bennett, knowing she would have loved the idea of books being available to anyone who wanted them. Clara visited her mother's grave every week, bringing flowers and sitting beneath the cottonwood tree to talk to Margaret about the children, the ranch, her life with James. She told her mother about Thomas's first steps and Emma's first words, and William's stubborn determination to do everything his older siblings did despite being far too small. She told her mother about the love that continued to deepen between her and James, how even after years of marriage he could still make her heart race with a single look. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Clara back to the pond where he had proposed. They sat together on the bank, watching the water sparkle, their hands intertwined, comfortable in the silence that comes from knowing another person completely. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked suddenly. "The way we came together, the circumstances? Do you ever wish you could have had a more conventional courtship?" Clara turned to look at him, seeing the gray threading through his dark hair now, the deeper lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. She thought he had never been more handsome. "Not for a single moment," she said honestly. "Yes, I wish my mother had lived. Yes, I wish my father had not died and left us in poverty. But I do not wish for a different path because every step, even the painful ones, led me to you, to this life, to our children. How could I regret any of that? I love you, Clara Cordell, more today than the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. And I love you, James. You are the answer to prayers I did not even know to pray." They kissed there beside the pond, two people who had found each other in the midst of desperate circumstances and had built something beautiful from that unlikely beginning. As the years continued to pass, the Cordell family became a cornerstone of the community. Clara involved herself in church activities and charity work, using her own memories of poverty to help others in need. James served on the town council and helped settle disputes between ranchers, his fairness and integrity earning him widespread respect. Their children grew strong and capable, learning to ride and rope and run the ranch, but also to read and write and think about the wider world beyond their Texas home. Thomas, the eldest, grew into a young man who loved the land as much as his father did. Emma became a gifted horsewoman who could gentle any horse on the ranch. William surprised everyone by developing a passion for drawing, sketching the landscape and animals with remarkable skill. When Thomas turned 20, he married a sweet girl from town named Anna, and they built a small house on Broken Arrow land. James officially made him a partner in the ranch, and Clara watched with pride as her son took on more responsibility. The first grandchild arrived a year later, another boy, and Clara held her grandson with tears of joy streaming down her face. "Look at you," James teased gently. You would think you had never seen a baby before. It is different when it is your grandchild, Clara insisted. This is Thomas's son, James, our grandson, the next generation of Cordells. James wrapped his arms around her from behind, both of them looking down at the sleeping infant. Your mother would have been so proud of you, he said softly. Of the family you have built, the woman you have become. I hope so, Clara whispered. I think of her often. I wish she could have known the children, could have seen all of this. She knows, James said with certainty. Somehow she knows, and she is proud. More years passed, bringing more changes. Emma fell in love with a young rancher from a neighboring property, and her wedding was a joyous affair that seemed to draw people from half the state. William surprised everyone by announcing he planned to attend university in Austin to study art and architecture, the first Cordell to pursue higher education. James had trouble accepting this at first, wanting his son to stay and work the ranch, but Clara helped him understand that they needed to let their children follow their own paths. James and Clara grew older together, their bodies becoming softer and slower, but their love remaining as strong as ever. Clara's hair turned silver, and James's face became deeply lined from a lifetime spent outdoors. But when he looked at her, she still saw the same intensity she had seen that first day in Thompson's general store. When she looked at him, she still felt her heart skip in response. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, the house overflowing with family and laughter. Clara stood on the porch that evening after everyone had left or gone to bed, looking out over the land that had become her home. James joined her, slipping his arm around her waist. What are you thinking about, wife of mine? I am thinking about that desperate girl who tried to steal medicine 30 years ago, Clara said. I am thinking about the cowboy who caught her and changed her life. I am thinking about how grateful I am for every single day between then and now. Even the hard days, were you? James asked. Even when we lost your mother, when we struggled through that drought year, when William broke his leg, when we thought we might lose the ranch? Even those, Clara confirmed, because we faced them together, because we had each other. The hard days made us stronger, James. They proved that what we have is real and lasting. Come to bed, James said, kissing her temple. We are not as young as we used to be. We need our rest. Clara let him lead her inside, through the house they had filled with love and life, up the stairs to their bedroom. As she settled into bed beside him, his arms coming around her in the automatic gesture of 30 years of practice, she thought about fate and chance and divine providence. That day she had slipped that medicine bottle beneath her shawl. She had thought she was stealing. She had not known she was reaching for salvation. She had not known that being caught would be the best thing that ever happened to her. She had not known that the cowboy with the gray-green eyes would become her whole world, but he had. And she had built a life beyond her wildest dreams from that terrible, desperate moment. She had taken her mother's dying wish for her happiness and had fulfilled it 1,000 times over. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. I love you too, James replied, his voice already thick with approaching sleep. Always have. Always will. Clara closed her eyes and smiled. Outside, the Texas wind whispered through the cottonwood trees. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. In the next room, the cradle James had built for their grandchild sat waiting for the next generation. Life continued its endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth. And through it all, through every season and every change, the love between Clara and James remained constant. It was the foundation on which everything else was built, the shelter that had protected them through every storm, the light that had guided them through every darkness. She had been caught stealing medicine for her dying mother. He had paid and taken them both home. And from that moment of crisis and kindness, a love story had unfolded that would echo through generations, a testament to the power of compassion and the unexpected places where we find our destiny. Clara drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, content and complete. knowing that whatever came next, whether more years together or the inevitable parting that awaited all mortals, they had lived well and loved deeply. They had honored Margaret's final wish. They had built something beautiful and lasting. They had found their happily ever after. The end.